So my talk today draws on a recently, well, more or less recently, it's over a year old now, but a more or less recently published book called Racial Prescriptions. Hold on. So it draws on my book, Racial Prescriptions, Pharmaceuticals, Difference, and the Politics of Life. And so the book basically focuses on a pharmaceutical called Bidil. And Bidil was developed as therapy for heart failure, which is a progressive chronic disease in which the heart's muscle gradually weakens, and little by little the heart loses its ability to pump enough blood to meet the body's metabolic needs. And the drug was the brainchild of Dr. J. Cohn, a cardiologist at the University of Minnesota. Now, based on a series of clinical trials conducted under the auspices of Veterans Affairs, Cohn sought to have the drug approved by the FDA for the general population, and this was back in the late 1990s. However, because of statistical issues with the VA trials, the FDA denied approval of the drug. So not discouraged, Cohn went back to the original data and found that the drug appeared to work better on African Americans than on whites. So with the prompting of the FDA, Cohn, along with the pharmaceutical company Nitromed, who had bought the rights to Bidil, they went back and conducted a clinical trial composed of only self-identified African Americans. And that trial is called the African American Heart Failure Trial, or AHEFT. And results from this trial indicated that compared to the placebo group, individuals who took Bidil showed significant survival benefits and a general improvement in their quality of life. So backed by this data and with the strong support of a number of African American organizations, including the NAACP and the Black Caucus, Cohn and Nitromed went back to the FDA to seek approval for the drug, but this time for blacks only. The FDA, citing, among other things, the disproportionate burden of heart failure in blacks and the need to develop effective treatment in this population in light of health disparities, approved the drug in June 2005 for the treatment of heart failure in self-identified black patients. So Bidil thus became the first drug endorsed by the FDA for a specific racial group. And it's still the only drug that's ever been approved for a specific racial group. So that's the story of Bidil kind of in a nutshell. And that's the bottle for Bidil. So what my book does is examine various aspects of the drug, its emergence as a racialized pharmaceutical, its imbrication in citizenship politics, its role in the biologization of race, and also its connection to the economic valuation of the racial body. In my talk today, what I want to do is focus on one of the overarching concerns of the book, this being the life politics of Bidil. So drawing on the work of Michel Foucault's work on biopower, I suggest that Bidil is implicated in what could be called a racial politics of life. And this is a politics that takes as its object the biological vitality of the racial body. Now, in the contemporary United States, matters of life and health have undoubtedly become key political concerns, and indeed, fostering the vitality of the living body through practices ranging from basic primary care to high-tech medicine has developed into the central objective of political and other authorities. Now, important to this politics vitality is the desire to overcome disparities in health. From heart disease and diabetes to cancer and asthma, the populations most afflicted by a range of illnesses are racialized minorities. The solutions generally proposed to the problem of racial health disparities have been social and environmental in nature, but in the wake of the mapping of the human genome, genetic thinking has come to have considerable sway in the way in which health disparities are problematized. Essentially, the hope is that genetically grounded medicine will play a central role in ameliorating race-based health inequalities, and pharmaceuticals targeted at specific racial groups are seen as key to this politics of life. They promise to bring the benefits of modern medicine to socially excluded populations. Now, importantly, while BIDIL may ostensibly be about fostering the vital forces of the racial body, its politics of life also raises thorny questions about the biologization of race. Numerous scholars have questioned how medicine can legitimately employ notion of race that has time and again been deemed scientifically tenuous. Drawing on a wealth of population genetic research, they conclude that distinct races do not exist and that there's simply no biological justification for social racial groups. At issue for these critics is a likelihood that striving for health equity by treating the racial body as a genetic entity will lead to the naturalization of health disparities, permitting biological explanations to overshadow social, economic, and political understandings of disease. So my concern here today is to look both at the life-affirming aspects of BIDIL as well as its potentially exclusionary vital politics. And so one thing, in terms of the slides up here, they're very simple. They're mostly quotations from some of the literature that I draw from. So let me begin by briefly talking about biopower today. Now, in the history of sexuality, Michel Foucault remarks that biopower designates what brought life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations and made knowledge power an agent in the transformation of human life. So biopower amounts to nothing less than the taking charge of life by political power. It points to how political and other authorities have assigned themselves the duty of administering bodies and collectivities in order to optimize life. And pragmatically, what biopower entails is the introduction of all kinds of administrative measures meant to foster the health and wealth of the population. So this ranges from the introduction of public health to public education and so on and so forth. Now, Foucault largely focused on biopower as a life-affirming power, as a power that's aimed at investing life and making it grow. However, he did note that biopower also has what can be called a murderous, exclusionary underside. It is often the case, he suggested, that entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. So this means that biopower does not just foster life, it also routinely does away with it in order to preserve it. And the reasoning here is that the death of the other or the exclusion of the other, those deemed diseased, dangerous, unfit, and so on and so forth, will make life in general more healthy and pure. So the idea is that under this logic of biopower, it is both possible to simultaneously protect life and to authorize a Holocaust. And the perfect example of this way that biopower operates is a Nazi state. So one of the goals of the Nazi state was to create a new and better social order through fostering the vital qualities of the population. So to do this, they introduced measures such as anti-smoking campaigns, cancer research, and so on and so forth. But it was also thought that the health of the population could only really be preserved through the elimination of those elements that were deemed unfit. So the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, those deemed mentally defective, and so on and so forth. So the Nazi state is in many ways kind of represents this blending of the administration of life with the administration of death that are both part of the logic of the way in which biopower works. And it's in order to preserve life that then life is taken away. Now, one of the most influential recent reworkings of the concept of biopower comes from the anthropologist Paul Rabinow and sociologist Nicholas Rose. In both their individual and their collective work, they have sought to rethink biopower in light of developments in the genetic and biological sciences. Rabineau and Rose argue that although the economy of biopower no doubt has its circuits of exclusion and can turn into a type of murderous thanatopolitics, it generally operates according to what they call logics of vitality. As they put it, if biopower sutures together the management of life and the management of death, today the dream of power focuses on the pole of life. So their work is very much concerned with exploring projects for making live. That is, they're concerned with schemes that have life rather than death as their telos. Central to Rabineau and Rose's vision is the claim that biopower today is principally concerned with our growing capacity to control, manage, engineer, reshape, and modulate the very vital capacities of human beings as living creatures. And this claim rests on the observation that as a result of developments in the life sciences, there has been a fundamental change in society's capacity to engineer human vitality. And this change is essentially one of scale, involving a move from a molar to a molecular understanding of life. So the term molar here, at least the way in which Rose and Rabineau use it, refers to the body at the level of hormones, blood, tissues, organs, limbs, and so forth. It is at this molar scale that the clinical medicine of the 19th and 20th centuries sought to know and act upon the body. So the molar body, according to Rose, was one that was revealed to the gaze of the physician after death in the postmortem dissection, visualized in the anatomical atlas, accessed in life through any number of devices, starting with a stethoscope, that would augment the clinical gaze and allow it to peer into the organs and systems of the living body. Now, although this kind of molar level is still important in biomedicine today, Rose and Rabineau suggest that it has been superseded by a molecular vision of biological existence. And Rose puts it as follows. Life is now understood and acted upon at the molecular level in terms of the functional properties of coding sequences of nucleotide bases and their variations, the molecular mechanisms that regulate expression and transcription, the link between the functional properties of proteins and their molecular topography, the formation of particular intracellular elements, ion channels, enzyme activities, transporter genes, memory potentials, with their particular mechanical and biological properties. So at this molecular level, life appears as a collection of intelligible vital elements that can be identified, isolated, controlled, mobilized, and reassembled. As such, life is no longer seen as natural or immutable destiny. Rather, it is envisioned as artificial, as inherently manipulable and reformable, open to calculative interventions and administration. So from this perspective, biopower today is essentially about the administration and maximization of life. It is about how individuals, together with the doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, and others who target life as the prime object of their knowledge and intervention, it's about how this collectivity has made fostering biological existence a central stake in politics. So where can we locate the life politics of Bidil? Now, to some degree, the vital politics of Bidil as a racially specific drug clearly falls within the life-affirming politics sketched out by Rabineau and Rose. Now, important to this understanding is the mapping of the human genome. So in 2000, the Human Genome Project, or HGP, succeeded in mapping or sequencing the 3 billion base pairs that make up human DNA. And the primary impetus behind the mapping of the human genome was to search for ways to prevent, diagnose, and cure disease. So it's essentially about mapping human health or improving human health. So the idea was that the decoding of the genome would permit scientists to identify human genes and thereby enhance our knowledge of the biochemical processes of the human body and also the genetic causes of disease. Now, in regard to the subject of race, the initial pronouncements following the sequencing of the human genome focused on the sameness of humanity. The sequence showed that humans share 99% of their genetic makeup, so HEP scientists proclaim that human beings were essentially like genetically, and that racial differences have no basis in biology. And it's not just scientists were saying this. There was a big rollout of the human genome in which President Bill Clinton spoke. He made the same pronouncement: race does not exist as a biological entity. However, other genomic researchers soon began to argue that even a 0.1% difference, or a 1% variation in genetic composition could translate into biomedically significant differences, and that these differences notably mapped on to traditional understandings of race. So the current trend in genomic research is to increasingly focus on that small amount of genetic variation that separates one human being from another, with racial and ethnic categories, which are presumed to signify biological difference, serving as necessary variables. Now, notably, the justification for this type of genomic research is still to enhance human health and vitality. Knowledge of human genomic variation, particular racial and ethnic differences in disease susceptibility and drug response, is thought to be potentially valuable in making medical diagnoses and in dispensing treatment. So it's very much the same logic. I think there's scientists who are doing this kind of work are very interested in really finding specific mechanisms that will help us understand the diseases and other maladies that affect racial minority populations. Now, this molecular inscription of race, as anthropologist Duane Fulwiley calls it, that is, the understanding of race at the level of genes and molecules, is in many ways fundamentally different from the older molar visions of human difference. And by molar visions, I'm referring here to 19th and early 20th century racial science and the effort to use physical features to construct classificatory systems of humankind in which racial groups were ranked in relationship to one another and some deemed kind of naturally inferior and superior to others. And of course, those kind of hierarchies were used to justify the subordination of particular groups. Now, today's understanding or scientific ways of thinking about race generally, and I do mean generally because I think there are exceptions, but generally they do not by and large have domination and subordination as their goal. They do not aim to set up immutable hierarchies of difference, discover essential racial truths, stigmatize individuals and populations, legitimate inequality, or eliminate the biological enemy. Rather, their general principle is that of hope that discovering the genetic mechanisms or genetic factors underlying human disease might lead to intervention that will increase the health and well-being of racial minority populations. So the politics of race and genomics is very much grounded not in the kind of murderous underside of biopower, but in its life-affirming pole. What might be called the molecular vital politics of race is about maximizing the quality of individual and collective life in all its difference. In today's configuration of knowledge and power, racial life is not seen as destiny, as a specific biological fate to which individuals are consigned, but as potentially malleable and open to various kinds of positive interventions and transformations. Now, so Bidil is very much a product of a context in which pharmaceuticals targeted at populations based on the idea that they're genetically different is seen as a way to foster life. And this is very clear from the way that supporters of BiDeal, including many African American organizations, articulated the need for the drug. And so on one level, what I suggest is that advocacy for BiDeal as a pharmaceutical aimed at African Americans can be understood in terms of biological citizenship, which is a concept that was developed by anthropologist Adriana Petrina. Now, generally speaking, the term biological citizenship refers to the linking of rights and citizenship to matters of health, disease, and illness. It includes any citizenship project in which ideas of citizenship are tied to beliefs about the corporal biological life of human beings. Such citizenship projects have become an important part of the political landscape of the United States, with individuals and communities increasingly understanding themselves in somatic terms and defining what it means to be a citizen in the idiom of vital rights, rights to life, health, and healing. Now, so in many ways, advocacy for BiDeal, especially on the part of African Americans, is precisely about vital rights. It is about entitlement to health services, improving care, and hope for better treatment. It is grounded in the belief that the African American community, which has historically been excluded from the benefits of biomedicine, deserves access to life-saving medications. And central here is the idea that African Americans have particular health needs that might be genetically based, and that medications targeted to this population are essential to realizing the hope of finding cures and achieving healthy bodies. Now, as a biological citizenship project, the promotion of BiDeal has basically offered hope to a suffering population undeserved by the biomedical establishment. Now, this biochemical materialization of hope, that is, the way in which hope is materialized in a pharmaceutical product, has two important dimensions. First, BiDeal is touted as being about saving African American lives and improving the quality of individual and collective existence. And so the message the drug is supposed to send is that the illnesses of African Americans are worthy of being treated and that African American lives are worth saving. Now, second, the promise of BiDeal is more generally about reducing health disparities. It has to do with eliminating the inequities that exist between blacks and other populations as regard cardiovascular health. So here, the prospects of health and happiness are very much intertwined with access to pharmaceuticals, or at least to this particular pharmaceutical. Now, we can see these two dimensions of the biochemical materialization of hope in how African American organizations advocated for BiDeal. So on June 16th, 2005, the Cardiovascular and Renal Drug Advisory Committee of the FDA held a day-long meeting to discuss the new application for BiDeal. And so, in terms of the drug approval process, a drug has to be discussed first at these committee meetings, and these committees then recommend to the FDA whether to approve the drug or not. So in this case, the drug is being explored by the Cardiovascular and Renal Drug Advisory Committee. So they held this meeting in June 2016, and that forum, there were numerous speakers from people from the drug company, scientists, and so on and so forth. But there were also a significant number of African American organizations or representatives from a number of African American organizations that spoke in favor of the drug. And these organizations included the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Minority Health Foundation, and the National Medical Association. And one point they all emphasized was the life-enhancing benefits of the drug. So for example, Gary Puckrin, speaking on behalf of the National Minority Health Foundation, put it in the following way: as evidenced by by the AHEF results, approval of Bidil will have an immediate and positive impact on the health and quality of life of many patients with heart failure. I support Bidil because it will extend the life of many Americans with heart failure. I support it because it will improve the quality of life of these patients. Now, another point that they all stress was the potential for Bidil to reduce health disparities. And this point was put most clearly by Congressman Donna Christensen, representing the Congressional Black Caucus. And she says, today, ladies and gentlemen, you have before you an unprecedented opportunity to significantly reduce one of the major health disparities in the African American community, and in doing so, to begin the process that will bring some degree of equity and justice to the American healthcare system. And so ultimately what happens is that during the course of the meeting, you have these very powerful calls from these organizations for the FDA committee to recommend approval of the drug. And this is put forth more clearly by Lucille Perez, representing the National Medical Association. She states, given the disproportionate impact of cardiovascular disease on African Americans, anything short of approval cannot be justified. The National Medical Association urges this committee to recommend to the FDA that Bidil be approved. African Americans continue to die from heart disease at the alarming rate of 78,000 a year. This number could be significantly reduced if Bidil is brought to the market as soon as possible. So for a lot of these spokespeople, or the way in which what these spokespeople did was essentially construct African Americans as a community of biological suffering and demanded recognition for this population on the basis of their damaged biology. And they also saw Bidil as offering blacks the opportunity to achieve a measure of health, prolong their lives, and reduce the inequalities between themselves and others with respect to cardiovascular health. And in general, so this is just one example of the kind of language that was used, but in general, if you look at the broader debate, so the language of citizenship and exclusion and the necessity of approving this drug because of that historical exclusion of African Americans from the benefits of biomedicine were really prevalent in all these debates. Now, to argue that the vital politics of Bidil are on the side of life is not to suggest that the drug is problem-free. And in fact, the drug is problematic from a number of dimensions. And so here I just speak some of the scientific and political problems with approving this drug for just African Americans. So scientifically, there are at least two problems with the approval of Bidil for blacks only. First, such approval gives the impression, even if not intended, that the drug will work on all blacks, but this is simply not the case. Given the genetic diversity of the African American population, the drug will only work on some individuals, but the approval of Bidil seemingly ignores intergroup variation and drug response. So one of the interesting things, if you look at the way in which African Americans are represented in sort of genomic research, it's often the case that there is this homogenization of this population that if you look at it kind of genetically, because everyone, if you look at genetic evolution, because everyone is descended from Africa, African Americans are actually, or Africans in general, are the most biologically diverse population. But in the imagination of the United States, they routinely get constructed as kind of this homogeneous grouping. So that's one issue in terms of this constructing African Americans as this genetic homogeneous group. Now, second, even if there are differences in how various populations react to drugs, they all tend to overlap significantly in their response. So summarizing a paper that analyzes data from 15 studies of antihypertensive drug, Steve Epstein, sociologist at Northwestern, notes the following. So even though whites on average respond better to beta blockers and ACE inhibitors than blacks did, and blacks on average responded better to diuretics and calcium channel blockers than whites did, overall 80 to 95% of blacks and whites had similar responses to these various drugs. So the implications here is really that there's little scientific justification for approving a drug for just one population. And there are also a number of other issues. So one of them is that the trial on which the approval of Biden was based was only in African Americans. It was the trial, AFF was composed of just self-identified African Americans, but then you're making claims that the drug works on African Americans and not on others, but you can't make that claim if you did not do any sort of comparative study. But those kind of claims were made anyways. And there are also other issues. So politically, there are also at least two key problems with Biden. First, there is the question as to the utility of trying to deal with health disparities through genetics. Although Biden might be touted as helping to reduce inequalities in health, the drug could actually contribute to the reproduction of inequality. For example, if too much weight is given to genetics as an explanatory factor in disease causality, the effect could be to minimize other unproven explanations of health disparities, namely the social and physical environment. To underestimate the influence of the social environment as an explanatory mechanism would be to risk reproducing the very disparities that one is trying to overcome. And this is probably put most poignantly by Jonathan Kahn, who's a legal scholar who's been one of the biggest critics of Biden or its approval for just African Americans. So he notes, to the extent that there are real disparities that correlate with racial groups, an overemphasis on genetics as an explanation for the disparity can lead to a misallocation of intellectual and material resources. For example, hypertension, a primary cause of heart failure, is caused by a wide array of factors, some social, some environmental, some genetic. There are disparities in the incidence of hypertension between blacks and white. The drive to reduce such racial disparities to a function of genetic variation fuels a logic that would concentrate resources needed to redress disparities on pharmaceutical interventions that work at the molecular level, rather than addressing larger issues of diet, behavior, racism, and economic inequity that also play significant roles in hypertension. And in fact, there's research by Catherine Bliss, who's a sociologist at the University of California in San Francisco, who's looked at kind of funding, and indeed it's actually already the case that money has been funneled into research on the genomics of health disparities and basically funneled away from looking at other or dealing with other issues that could help ameliorate health disparities. So that's one political problem. The second one is that even though contemporary racialized medicine does not seek to stigmatize individuals and populations, this does not mean that it cannot. When a racially defined group is identified as having a higher genetic susceptibility to a particular disease, there is always the possibility that this group will become stigmatized. And so, for example, we can look at early efforts to screen for sickle cell anemia, which resulted in the racialization of the disease as black, even though other subgroups also showed high incidences of the condition. So the outcome was that African Americans experienced substantial discrimination in employment and in insurance. So that this kind of scenario can play out again is not out of the question. As Sharona Hoffman notes, another legal scholar, public perception that scientific evidence has established that a particular race is more vulnerable to life-threatening illnesses than others, or or does not respond to medications that cure others may reinforce negative race-based stereotypes and misconceptions. Particular populations may be seen as diseased or incurable, which could fuel the belief that they are inferior kind of human subspecies. So I think one of the issues, so if you look at kind of genomic scientists who do research on kind of the genetics of difference and trying to deal with health disparities, a lot of them usually focus on one sort of particular condition, whether it's diabetes, heart disease, and so on and so forth. So, and then a lot of times they spend their life focusing on a particular disease. So, and most of these scientists are really very concerned. They do want to improve the health of the populations that they're working with. But when you get, let's say, one group saying that African Americans or Latinos or other racial groups are more susceptible, one group saying they're most susceptible to heart disease, another group is saying that they're more susceptible to diabetes, another group is saying that they're more susceptible to this disease or that disease. The collective portrait that emerges is that African Americans, and this also is the case for Latinos, that somehow there's something genetically wrong with this population, that they're susceptible to all these diseases. So I think for critics, this is kind of very suspicious, that African Americans or Latinos will be genetically predisposed to all these conditions. And so even though they might be well-meaning, so this collective portrait is one that lends itself to this idea that there's somehow something biologically wrong with these populations. So basically, I think the practice of geneticizing African Americans can have rather significant and negative consequences. Now, let me conclude with the following. So in this talk, I have argued that we need to locate BiDeal within the life-affirming side of biopolitics. I have suggested, on the one hand, that drugs targeted at particular racialized groups are ostensibly about fostering the vitality of the racial body. And indeed, the promoters of BiDeal on some level plainly aim to save lives and improve the quality of people's biological existence. As such, BiDeal is integrally connected to issues of rights and citizenship. Racialized drugs are about the right of socially excluded populations to have access to the benefits of modern medicine. They are about the recognition of biological survival as a supreme value and the obligation to safeguard a person's bodily being. On the other hand, I have also noted that drugs such as BiDeal, while drugs such as BiDeal might save African American lives and bring a measure of hope to a community that has historically been denied access to the benefits of modern medicine, we need to be mindful of the exclusionary vital politics of racialized drugs. Specifically, we must be careful not to obscure the social significance of race and reduce health disparities to health differences grounded simply in biology and genetics. And we must be wary of the stigmatizing potential of conflating race with biology. In neglecting the social and in biologizing race, there's a danger that medical and societal inequities will simply intensify with race-based medicine. The point then is that although biopower in the post-genomic age might be grounded on the side of life and not be explicitly murderous, it nevertheless has an underside. We thus need to be attentive to both the life-affirming aspects of racialized medicine and its potentially exclusionary politics of life. Thank you.